John Blickman joins me this week to discuss brewing equipment for craft breweries. This is Beersmith Podcast number 270. This is Beersmith Podcast number 270, and it's late November 2022. John Blickman joins me this week to discuss equipment selection for craft breweries. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Are you thinking about opening your own brewery? Craft Beer and Brewing is sponsoring a brewery workshop at Fort Collins, Colorado, where you can connect with experts who have built successful breweries. The workshop runs from 26 February to 1 March 2023 and is your opportunity to learn from the pros. For more information, visit breweryworkshop.com. Again, that's breweryworkshop.com. And Blickman Engineering is approaching 22 years in business, and they want to take this opportunity to give back this holiday season. Their Black Friday program is better with Blickman, with a full week of unprecedented deals to make it easier to take your brewery to the next level. It all centers around their most popular products like the Hellfire burners, Riptide pumps, G4 fermenters, the Boilermaker kettles, and the Brew Easy systems. The sale starts on 22 November, and discounts are taken automatically at checkout. For all the details, visit BlickmanEngineering.com. Again, that's BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, I launched a new version of the Beersmith Forum a few weeks ago, as well as made some significant security upgrades. The Beersmith Discussion Forum is a place where you can discuss all things brewing, including techniques, ingredients, equipment, pro brewing, and our Beersmith recipe software. Join the conversation today at beersmith.com/forum. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome back John Blickman. John is founder and president of Blickman Engineering, a provider of premium home and professional brewing equipment. John has helped hundreds of brewers start craft breweries, and he's also my good friend. John, it's great to have you back on the show.
Great to be back, Brad.
How are you doing? What have you been up to lately?
Went on one of my bucket list items on a elk hunt in Colorado.
Nice.
Didn't get an animal, but got to see one really up close and a bunch of cows at a distance, and all that was really beautiful. Great experience.
Awesome.
But other than that, just trying to get some, more designs done and new products out and all that good stuff.
Cool.
Pretty much what we do day in and day out.
Yeah, I know. I know you have been working on a number of new products. Do you want to talk a little bit about any of them?
Well, some of the new ones that we've got out are for an arrangement we have with Keg King out of Australia, and they're more on the dispensing end, and so we're distributing our products through them, and we're distributing their products here in the U.S. So they've got some really nice PET conicals that are pressure capable. Some kegs that they have that are also PET.
So those are plastic conicals, basically, right?
Right. And, just a number of neat products through them that we're selling. Kegerators. They've got some really neat new taps. One of them is a flow control, but they call it the twist. And you just twist the handle on the tap, and that's your actual flow control. So it's pretty neat.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah, so you can kind of adjust it while you're actually pouring, right?
Right. So it's basically a one-handed, adjustment of flow, and you don't have to have the extra hand for the little valve. You can use that to hold your glass. So
nice. And I think the other topic you had put in my notes, anyways, was something about pressure fermentation. I think you got some new products related to that.
That's right. We've got our new G4 conical that has tons of new features, like external level gauge and some really neat racking valve that is super easy to take very sanitary samples with. And that's pressure capable up to 15 PSI. So if you do want to do some carbonation, dispensing, you can use it as a regular uni-tank. It has all the features of a regular conical. We've also So
I was just going to mention, back quite a while ago now, but we had you and Chris White on talking about pressure fermentation of lagers and how it can reduce the esters as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that 15 psi is about the sweet point for pressure fermentation
Hmm.
to suppress that, so they can make room temperature lagers that are pretty darn close to traditional lagers. And then, as I mentioned before about the PET products, those are all pressure capable as well. So you can do pressure fermentations in those. In fact, those a lot of those go up to over 30 psi. So you can even carbonate at room temperature with those.
Nice. Well, way back in episode 199, we talked a little bit about the business aspects of pro brewing, and you walked us through, aspects of a business plan, and a lot of people don't realize, but pro brewing really is just a lot of business related to that. But today I wanted to focus a bit on pro brewing equipment. So,
Sure.
So I was wondering if you could describe, some of the major differences between home brewing and pro brewing, equipment wise.
Equipment wise is it's similar but different, and here's where I'm going with that. You've got to kind of put your homebrew mindset aside, and with pro brewing, you've got to really realize that you've got to focus on making money. And not that it's all about money, but you need to have that mindset so that you can keep your business rolling and growing. And some of those things are what we do with equipment is how do we make that brew day faster? Also, how do we make that brew day more, or the equipment more economical? And such things that I know there's a lot of people that do CIP for their homebrewing equipment just because it's fun and easy. With commercial equipment, for example, CIP is almost a necessity.
Can you talk about CIP? A lot of people may not be familiar with the term.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
CIP is clean in place, and it's really what most commercial food industries do, breweries do, pharmaceutical companies do, and it's it's really with home brewing. You can just reach into the kettle and scrub it.
Yeah, I throw it in the tub or throw it in the sink and brush it out.
Right. And most times for homebrewing, that's just way faster than setting up the CIP equipment, which involves, hot cleaners such as caustic, PBW, that kind of thing. And then followed by, most cases, a acid rinse
mm-hmm.
or a sanitizing and then a rinse afterwards, depending on what you're using. So there's some setting up and moving of the pumps and the chemicals and the tanks. But it's really the only way to clean those big commercial tanks, other than climbing inside and trying to scrub them by hand, which, some of them, there's just regulations of enclosed spaces and all that to deal with. That's one of the big things, but a lot of it is you're not picking up and lifting, you're really pumping and moving everything. And things are really focused towards, oxygen ingress prevention, which is really taking, a front seat now in homebrewing,
mm-hmm.
Where you'll see people moving tanks under pressure. And that really started in the commercial end, but that's one of the only ways they could really move the beer effectively. So you use CO2 pressure or nitrogen pressure, depending, to push the beer from one tank to another in a tank that is already purged with nitrogen or CO2.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the big thing with the pro is just focusing and realizing that the equipment's physically larger, so you generally have to have bigger hoses, bigger pumps, and and the ability to move product without picking it up and moving it. So there's the core science of it is pretty much the same as home brewing, and that's why a lot of home brewers have a fairly easy transition to the pro. It's more just letting go of some of the home habits, and because a lot of it too is with home, you've got all the time you want to fiddle with it, and that's a lot of the fun of the hobby. With pro, you've got so many other things to do in the brewery that you've got to focus on. Hey, I need to get this brew day done with quickly, so that I can move along to clean tanks, so that I can move along to work in the front end of the business.
Well, and not only that, time is money when you got the beer sitting there, right?
Absolutely, it is. So you're looking, with, for me with, home brewing, I have no problem letting a beer, sit there for a couple of weeks to clarify because I'm not in a big hurry. With a pro brewer, that tank is now sitting there for 2 weeks waiting to clarify. Uh, I'm either going to filter or which is not super common, particularly in the smaller pro breweries, but using readily available fining agents such as, biofine, isinglass, those kind of things. So you're
Yeah.
clarifying a lot quicker and then moving that product to the tap as quickly as possible.
Well, let's start at the beginning in terms of selecting equipment. So, how do you go about properly sizing the brewing kettle, the mash tun? I know most breweries are measured by their brewing system size, right?
Right. So the key thing, as we talked about a lot of the business side of brewing on that previous episode. Um, from that will come what your brew system size should be, and that's after having done just a quick review, having done a market study to know um, similar breweries in similar communities, what are they selling, volume wise. Am I going to have just several flagship beers and then just shift in a couple different beers every few weeks, or is my plan to have 12 different beers that are constantly changing? So in the case of the prior, you can brew with bigger batch sizes, so you don't have to brew as much and small and a fewer number of tanks, because you can just you're basically brewing that same thing, and you can move that off to a bright and move it into kegs. With if you're intending to have 12 different beers on tap, you're going to have to brew frequently and most likely smaller batch sizes because you're not going to be selling as much of each if you're have 12 different beers on tap.
Right. And all this is really tied to your business model too, right? If you're selling
really
selling out of a tap room, are you bottling? Are you kegging? Are you selling kegs?
Distribution,
Yeah.
all that. Yeah, absolutely. And Brad, if you want to pull up that tank planner, because we get a lot of questions on, from customers, and we're happy to answer those and talk to people, even, if you're just starting to think about it and kicking the tires, please call us. We can, help give you some information just to get you going. And, and we're here to do that. And,
right.
But our tank planner was a result
there,
of
I pulled it up now. So
yeah, there you go.
On the video.
So we put that on our webpage. You can go to Pro Blickman Engineering, click on the Pro Brewing tab, and off to the right, you'll see a tank planner. And this is a calculator that we put together that's great for, just doing what if scenarios with your brewery. So you can put in, how much time your ale fermenters or ales will sit in the fermenter. So let's, if we put in there, 2 weeks, and, for lagers, maybe we're going to let, have those in there for 5 weeks, and some of that again is, you can do lagers faster with different yeasts and things like that. So you can play around with how much time they're going to stay in there.
Sure.
And then, we've got, how long are they going to sit in a bright tank? And you might just be trying to clarify in your conical, in which case you just, you wouldn't have that as a separate bright tank, but you could just add that on to the length of time that beer will sit in there before you run it off. Let me see here.
And you have the percent of ales and so on.
Right. So, if you're going to do like 80% ales and only 20% lagers, that'll give you, kind of a split there. And how many dedicated bright serving tanks. And by that, we mean if it's a flagship beer, and you're not wanting to keg that beer off to serve it on your taps, a lot of places would just have a bright beer tank that they use as a serving tank. If you're going to keg everything off, you can probably get by with just one. So that's a good scenario to play with too. And then the next thing you can do is type in you need to really type in two two of the fields. So if you know what your production is going to be
Yeah.
per year, how many barrels you need per year to keep up with production. And, we always try to recommend trying not to brew more than 3 times a week.
Right.
That'll give you an idea of your brew house size, and then also your fermenters and bright tanks of that size that you'll need.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just a neat tool that we put together to play around with that.
So that kind of gets you in the ballpark, I guess.
It does, and we've really checked this with a lot of had a number of pro breweries that have been in business for a while, run their scenario, and they were surprised how accurate it really ends up being. So it'll give you a pretty good estimate of what you need to do, and also when you're changing brew house size, how many brews per week you need to do. So you can really tweak and play with what you want to do, because there's a lot of times where you've only got so much cash up front to come up with the bulk of your equipment.
Right.
So you may decide, geez, for the first 6 months, I'm going to brew 5 days a week, and really run these through the fermenters quickly, and I'm not going to brew lagers just so that I can get enough cash flow moving to get the rest of my tanks.
Mm-hmm.
So you can really play around with this and your business plan a lot.
So I'm thinking a lot of smaller places are like 3 barrels, and then we jump up more. A lot of the more professional places go to 5-7 barrel systems, right?
Right. We actually got started in the 1 barrel size. Geez, probably.
I have been to a couple 1 barrel breweries, actually.
Yeah, the way back in 2006, I remember our first one was in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. Beautiful location, a ski town, and there were ones where they had 12 different beers on tap, and they brewed nearly every day, during the big ski season, and that's how they got started. And that's really how we got started. And then, we've, developed, 2 barrel, 3.5 barrel, 5 barrel.
I know you make 7s too now, right?
We do. We make 7s. So, some of them are, we kind of call them a hybrid between a home brewing and a pro brewing, where, a lot of the big pro stuff where it's all on a skid with all hard pipe and integral controls and all that. Those are pretty much necessary when you go into bigger systems, because you can spend so much time moving hoses around, and it's just not practical when you get up to those bigger brew house sizes. So those are great. In the nano, you'll see a lot, and the approach that we've taken is, kind of having a not homebrew, but not the full skidded system.
Mm-hmm.
So, we've done like single wall, and by that I mean they're not insulated or, jacketed. So they're just a larger, scaled up homebrew tank.
Mm-hmm.
And you move the hoses around instead of having the hard piping, and that they cost significantly less. Most homebrewers obviously are used to moving hoses around.
Yeah.
And even in the cellar in a pro brewery, you're still moving hoses around.
Yeah.
So what that gives you is not only a more economical brewery to start with, but it's more familiar to homebrewers. It's all at ground level. You can reach in. You're raking it out, through the grain through a manway, which is different than homebrew, which you'd be scooping it out of the top.
Mm-hmm.
We sell mostly, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Most of them are electric powered, versus the larger systems, which are mostly steam fired.
Mm-hmm.
But that's some of the kind of differences there.
So
and
go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering. So what? Let's say I want to pick a brewing system, the actual brewing system. I've seen, I've been to a variety of pro breweries that some of them have very simple systems, and some of them have, really pretty exotic, almost automated systems. What are some of the features and options you can pick when you're picking a kettle and a mash tun?
Boy, some of the features, I think what's bare minimum and what we include in most other nano size brewery equipment have is a a simple way to heat it, which is mostly electric with removable elements, so you can clean them.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have a control panel that is usually fairly basic, and and it's just to maintain temperature, so you can maintain your hot liquor temperature. And a lot of people use their boil kettle as their strike water heater, and then you'll have pumps, one or two pumps to move your strike water and sparge water through the system. And again, you'll be doing that through hoses. You'll generally have a whirlpool fitting in your brew kettle so that you can whirlpool.
Yeah, can you describe that? Because a lot of people may not be familiar. We use the term whirlpool hops all the time, but I mean in a professional system, it actually does create a whirlpool within the
right
within the boiler.
And in the pro environment with the tanks that are that big, it's very difficult to get in there with a paddle and stir it in a swirling motion, and to get all that hop and true particulates to settle towards the center of the tank.
Yeah, I mean, you want to separate. I guess the main purpose of the whirlpool is really to separate things, right?
It is. It really is. And and that whole idea is, particularly in a pro environment, you're nearly always pumping it through a plate heat exchanger, and you do want to keep as much particulate out of those as you can. But instead of actually stirring with a paddle, you have a tangential port, about a third up from the bottom of your kettle,
Mm-hmm.
and you pump from the bottom of the kettle, the outlet, through your pump, and then into this tangential port, which causes the whole amount of wort in your boil kettle to just circulate. And we're not talking real fast where it's got to be where there's a little tornado vortex in the middle of the thing.
Sure.
That's really not needed, and to a large degree not desired, because you don't want to whip it up with oxygen. But and then you'll let that settle for half hour or so, and then you can start pumping off. And what that does, that lets all that sediment stay behind, and then you can pump clear wort to your fermenter.
And of course, this is when they add whirlpool hops too, right?
Right. That's a very common time to add whirlpool hops. It's right at knockout, and it will start cooling just a little bit as you're recirculating.
Mm-hmm.
And some people will actually try to cool down if you're doing, for example, New England IPAs, where you want to do a hop stand at 170 or 180 degrees.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in a homebrew environment, for example, you can really just reach in with a spoon and stir it and get it going, and it does a pretty decent job. But the reality is, with a tank that's so small, the hop pile usually just kind of spreads out anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But it's fun to have, in a home environment, just having a whirlpool that you can play around with a pump and do some fun things with.
Yeah.
So there's places and times for all those things, but it really started in a lot of the in the pro environment.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the physical considerations of crushing and mashing large amounts of grain? I know I've seen a number. Yeah, I've seen exotic
Mm-hmm.
systems on this end as well, with augers and all kinds of things.
Right. In the the larger systems, what's typical is a grist hydrator. So you either grind on the fly or you pre-grind the grain, and then an auger will dump it into this device on the top of your mash tun that has your strike water pumping through it. So you'll have the mixing of the grain and the water basically at the top of your mash tun, and then it falls in.
So you don't have. I guess that avoids the big dough ball problem, right?
It does. And then the other issue with pro brewing is you've got so much water to get in, and you've got so much grain to get in. You just can't get it in, in 5 minutes. So it may take you 20 minutes to get all your grain in, and by that time you've got a lot of starch conversion that's already happening. In fact,
right.
In some cases it's mostly done. So you'll want to make sure that the combination of grist and water going into your mash tun are at that strike temperature that you want.
Right.
So, that's kind of some of the limitations. With the smaller systems, most people do not use in the nano size, do not use an auger for their grain. They'll generally crush into bins, more than just a 5-gallon bucket, but that might hold 50 pounds of malt. And there's two ways that I've seen this done. Is one where you've got somebody that's stirring while you're dumping the grain in, and you're generally getting that grain in within 5 to maybe 10 minutes. And as they're stirring, they're breaking up any dough balls. Some of these nano breweries do have mash mixers. You definitely will see that in the bigger pro systems, and the mash mixers are nice, but then it's that trade-off with cost. They're not inexpensive, and that's just an upfront cost, and you've just kind of need to decide, is the cost worth me saving a little bit of time and effort or not? And we offer systems with both. Most places do, I think. The other way I've seen it done, and this seems to work pretty well, is where you put it's called underletting. So you would move some of your strike water up, and let me back up a little bit. Part of the reason that you have to get, when you have your mash tun full of your strike water, that might be at 165 degrees, just to pull a number,
right?
And you want to settle that in at, say, 152. You've got to get the grain in there fairly quickly, because it's starting at 165, and the more grain you add, then it's cooling off to that 152. So you want to get that grain in there quickly, so the bulk of it is converting at 152, not 158, 160,
right.
that
sense.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Now, underletting, it kind of does it the opposite way. So you would actually pump over enough water to cover the false bottom by a couple inches. Then you would dump in all of your grain, and then you would continue slowly pumping your strike water from underneath the false bottom. So basically pumping it backwards through your mash tun through the outlet valve, and then gradually filling that up. And it does a pretty good job of avoiding dough balls, because it's just going in, the water's going in at a slower pace. But what that does is it's starting you from where the water's cooler, and then the more water you pump in, the hotter it gets. So then at those that 130, 140, that kind of temperature, the conversion's much slower. So then you're building up to that 152 or whatever your desired strike temp is. So that's a pretty slick way that a lot of pro brewers do on these tanks. In fact, I've even seen home brewers do that. I think Gordon Strong, that's his normal process, is underletting. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Well, many commercial breweries double or split batches to get into the fermenter. For example, I've seen a lot of breweries are like 3.5 barrel brewery, and then they feed it into maybe a 7 barrel fermenter, doubling the batch size. What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of doing this?
Yeah, that's actually a fairly common process. It allows you to do back-to-back brews, which makes for a fairly long brew day.
Yeah.
But it'll let you do so with a smaller, less costly system. This is a great option, particularly if you're going to have 2 or 3 flagship beers that you're going to have on tap, because you can double batch for those days. So so where you've got all the equipment out, you can pre-grind all the grain, so it's faster than 2 completely separate brew days. You don't have to clean the equipment in between, for example. So that works great for the flagship beers, but it also gives you a smaller system that you can brew your seasonals with fairly easily, where you can do smaller sizes. We also will have people that will just double batch and just create 2 different beers out of the same yeast or out of the same wort. So not as common as the double batching, just to get more beer done in one day.
Another consideration is, scheduling and managing all these fermenters and bright tanks to handle, you got overlapping batches going on, you got different fermentation times. How does some of the breweries manage all that?
That's what the Cellar Master does, and really there, I've seen a lot of people that do things just as simple as a whiteboard where they know what they've put in. They track their specific gravities every day. They know, they have a schedule for that day. I'm going to put clarifying agents in this beer, or I'm going to dump the yeast out and transfer it to my next batch that I'm going to brew, that same day. So a lot of it is just taking records and timing it. With some of our smaller breweries, we've seen a lot of breweries now using dry yeast. They're a lot cleaner than they used to be,
Hmm.
and they're a lot less expensive than they used to be. And then, in those cases, you can really avoid the repitching of the yeast. But most breweries still will repitch yeast, whether, it's, house yeast that they use for everything, or just, they may have one that they do for their fruitier ales and another that they use for their, more cleaner ales. And, so you've got to kind of time some of those. You can put it into a keg. A lot of people just use Cornelius kegs. That's one way to do it and pump it out. Or what a lot will like to do is when they're finishing up with one brew, they can dump that yeast right into the next fermenter. And it just, since it's almost still active, you get some great fermentations that way.
Wow, that's awesome.
Mhm.
I want to talk for a minute about bright tanks because most home brewers don't have bright tanks in their system. So, can you talk a little bit about how the bright tanks kind of fit into the overall production for a commercial brewery?
Yeah, absolutely. The bright tanks for pro brewers are more like the corny kegs for home brewers. And the whole point there is get your, there's a lot of talk about uni tanks, where you do everything in one vessel. So a conical fermenter that's capable of discharging yeast through the cone, but is also pressure capable, so you can actually clarify and carbonate your beer in there.
Right.
It's like a lot of things. If things that do everything don't do any particular one super well.
Uh huh.
So a lot of people will use the bright tank so that they can get the beer out of their conical fermenter, which does a phenomenal job fermenting.
Mm-hmm.
The bright tanks do a phenomenal job for clarification. They're generally wider in diameter and shorter, which means the sediment, or the yeast and protein that you're trying to clarify has less of a distance to fall, so they will clarify a little faster.
Okay.
Plus, it's clean, and you don't have that any of the yeast from the fermentation, Kreuzen ring from the fermentation that's in there as well. So that when you do transfer out of a bright, it's going to be very, very clean and free of all sediment. When you're doing that with a conical, it's a little more difficult to avoid any sediment coming through.
Mhm.
So the nice thing about that is, you keep your fermenters fermenting, and you keep your bright beers conditioning the beer, and so you'll transfer that over to the bright tank. You will want to purge from one, the receiving vessel, and normally you will make sure that the top of your fermenter is being purged with CO2 as you transfer it. And the whole idea there is to avoid any oxygen pickup. In fact, a lot of brewers, what they'll do is they'll connect a hose after they've purged their receiving vessel. They'll connect a hose from the top of the receiving vessel to the top of the fermenter, so that when you're pushing out
Gas.
the beer from the fermenter and filling up the bright tank is pushing the CO2 back to the fermenter. So it's kind of a closed loop setup.
That's pretty cool. Are you so I assume most of these bright tanks are pressure capable, so you can carbonate them as well.
Yeah, they absolutely are. They almost all of them are going to have a cooling jacket, so you'll have cold glycol that you'll run through these and keep them at your serving temperature,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll have carbonation stones in them. Excuse me, that will allow you to carbonate as you're clarifying as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you normally go through, where you transfer over, any sediment will drop. You'll start the carbonation process, and then shortly after, what you'll do is add your fining agents. Biofine is probably the most common one that people use,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got to play around with some of the techniques, as it's not as simple, particularly in a pro environment, to add the biofine and then be done. Sometimes you'll have to, some will be more stubborn than others depending on style, and you just need to keep good records of, it took this much biofine and I had to do it 2 times or 3 times to get it to clarify.
Well, so one of the other questions I had, what are some of the tricks that commercial brewers use to get their beer into the bottle quickly? Because they, again, they're trying to minimize production time. Time is money, right?
Absolutely. And one of the biggest things is making sure you have a healthy fermentation with plenty of yeast and well oxygenated. Because fermentations that are struggling take forever, and they don't clarify as well, and then that so it all goes downhill as if you've got a poor initial fermentation. So the best thing you can do is make sure you've got a really good aggressive initial fermentation. That gets you out of the fermenter faster, and it can get you through the bright tank faster as well. And again, if you're carbonating in that tank, you can do some things where you're venting off carbon dioxide at the top, which basically encourages more CO2 bubbles to flow through because it's being vented. But you have to balance that time with the cost of the carbon dioxide, particularly now with carbon dioxide costs going up.
Yeah. Interesting side story. Was it a volcano near St. Louis became active, I guess, and wiped out a lot of the CO2 supply for the U.S., something like that, right?
Crazy stuff.
It was insane.
Yeah.
Yeah. So finally, we get to serving and packaging, and I know some breweries, smaller breweries particularly, will serve directly out of the bright tank, but serving and packaging, obviously, a very important aspect of pro brewing.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that, the easiest is to serve out of a bright tank. The drawback there is a lot of times your bright tank will spend a lot of its time not being completely full. So what most brewers will do is they'll drop, when they get down to a certain level, they'll just transfer that into kegs,
mm-hmm.
and then put that in their their serving vessel. The next step would be, a lot of people will clarify, especially the very small breweries that, maybe 1 or 2 barrel. They will actually clarify in their kegs and just leave their kegs still so they don't stir up sediment. That's, I would highly recommend having at least 1 bright tank. And then, if you do want to transfer that all into kegs because you only have 1 bright, then you don't have to worry so much about 2 things. 1, sediment being stirred up, and the other thing is having yeast and proteins in your beer that can, over time, just change the flavor of that beer.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people that say, well, it really, the clarity of the beer doesn't, affect the flavor. And I'll go with a yes and a no on that.
Yeah.
If it's clear, that generally is, and it's easy to clarify, it's generally a sign you've had a good fermentation. But not having all that yeast and protein material in there will also make the malt flavors pop out a little bit more,
mm-hmm.
and it'll also age better for you.
Yeah.
So the next thing then is, you'll see a lot of people obviously that use growlers and crowlers for customers to take home out of their tap room. Now, if you're going to be distributing,
things get more complicated, right?
Things get a little bit more complicated, and you've really got to decide, am I going to package in kegs and distribute in kegs? Because a lot of these nanos will, they'll serve 90% of the beer out of their tap room, but it's great advertising to have some of your beer on tap at different restaurants or different bars in town.
Sure.
So people get a taste of that and go, wow, that's pretty awesome. I'm going to go check out that brewery here in town. That may not have otherwise. So it's great for advertising. So kegs are the easiest. You're obviously going to be wanting to use a Sankey type keg, from 1/6 of a barrel up to the half barrel.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of a decision to make, and whether you want to buy or lease those, a lot depends on, do you like cleaning kegs? Can you clean the kegs? If you're going to use a lot of kegs, having a small keg washer is very helpful. Then the next step is, if you want to sell in grocery stores or have people be able to take home 6-packs of your beer that are going to last longer than in a growler, would be canning. And a lot of people have contracted with contract canning companies, and some are very good and some are not.
Yeah, there's some. I guess there's some that even just come into your brewery and do a quick canning run, and then they leave with all their equipment.
Yeah, that's exactly. So when you're contract canning, that's really what you're doing, and they've got access to the cans, which is very helpful, because as a nano, it's harder to get cans than the bigger outfits. So they'll come in. What I would highly recommend doing is getting some recommendations from other breweries that have used this canning company. Most are pretty good, and most are getting a lot better, but there's still some that are not as careful with your beer as what you would be.
Mm-hmm.
That's the most common way. They do have smaller canning lines. I think Maheen and some others make smaller canning lines. And then there's the simple way of we have a lot of nanos that are using beer guns. It's time consuming, but it's inexpensive and gets the job done without oxidation.
Wow.
And you can just can what you need at that time. Whereas if you're bringing in a canning company, a lot of them will have minimum cans that they'll run. So you may run one or have to be ready for one or two different beer styles that you want to have canned, or maybe even end up canning more than you really want just to meet the minimums.
Mm-hmm.
So just kind of investigate all those things. And, again, back to your business plan is trying to decide, how am I going to distribute outside of my tap room?
Mm-hmm. Well, if your brewery's successful, you also want to consider future expansion. What are some things pro brewers can do to, up front to help future-proof their breweries, I guess?
Again, we go back to that business plan. A big part of your business plan is, what am I going to do when I grow? Where am I coming up with the money? And what equipment will I put in place next? What we see most breweries doing is adding fermenters, and or bright tanks, and opting to brew more frequently than trying to scrub everything and go with a new brew house and all new fermenters. And a lot of that, particularly with that tank planner, can help you know, okay, I need to add these when, I'm going to start at 500 barrels a year, just to throw a number out there.
Yeah.
But in 6 months, I want to be at 750 barrel rate. So it can let you know I need to be ready cash wise and space wise, and leave access in the building to get the equipment in is another key thing. So you're not having to cut holes in the roof or those kind of things. So you're planning and you're ready to add those tanks, and just keep in touch with, your equipment providers. I know we try to keep, fermenters and bright tanks in stock, but it's good to just kind of, give your equipment provider heads up so that they can be, ready for you when you're ready to pick another one up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really it. It's planning in advance, leaving the space for it, making sure that you've got adequate excess capacity in your glycol chiller, so that you can crash fermenters and keep all the other ones cool at the same time.
Yeah, power, gas, electricity, lighting, right? All that stuff.
All that stuff, yeah. Mm-hmm. And there's so much of that that's playing, and it's not that you've got to put all that equipment in right away. Just be ready to do that.
Nice. Well, John, any final advice to help brewers looking to go pro so they can select the right equipment up front?
A lot of that really boils down to checking out communities about your size and style. If you're in a suburbia of Chicago or New York City is going to be different than a suburb or a small town in Minnesota or Iowa. So just kind of find a community that's similar to yours in size and in kind of whether it's a Midwestern or suburb of a big city, and go visit some of those and see what these brewers are doing and talk to them, and they can give you a pretty good idea of what worked for them and what didn't work for them, and what they would recommend if they had to do it over. And if they're in different communities, most cases, most brewers are super open even to other businesses in town, other breweries in town. But they're the ones that are in a completely different town are really open to talking to you about it. And we can help with that. I'm assuming most equipment manufacturers can, try to set you up with, hey, here's a brewery that is doing about the same thing you're doing in a similar location, and we can hook them up with you to help out. And a lot of it too is if you just have questions, just to kind of reassure yourself that you're thinking down the right path and those kind of things, just reach out to your equipment providers. We have lots of tire kickers, and that's great. Happy to help out with all that, because there's just, the more planning you do, the more likely you are to have a successful business, and that's what everybody wants for that first brewer that's starting their first small business.
Well, John, really appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you for being here. It's great to hear your wisdom on pro brewing.
Absolutely. I've always been a firm believer of give where you take, and it's really neat. For me personally, just to see all these new breweries starting up, and having people just appreciate that you were able to help them out, and it's just a fun market. The nano segment is it's real personal, and it's just great getting to meet a lot of these people. So.
Well, my guest today was John Blichmann, President and CEO of Blichmann Engineering, provider of both pro and home brewing equipment. Thank you again, John.
Absolutely.
A big thank you to John Blichmann for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. If you want to start your own brewery, join them at the Colorado Brewery Workshop, where you can connect with experts who have built successful breweries. To sign up, go to breweryworkshop.com. Again, that's breweryworkshop.com. And Blichmann Engineering is approaching 22 years in business. They want to take this opportunity to give back this holiday season. Their Black Friday sale with Blichmann is a full week of unprecedented deals to make it easier to take your brewery to the next level. It all centers around their most popular products like the Hellfire burners, Riptide pumps, G4 fermenters, Boilermaker kettles, and the BrewAzy systems. The sale starts on 22 November, and discounts are automatically taken at checkout. For all the details, visit BlichmannEngineering.com. Again, that's BlichmannEngineering.com. And I launched a new version of the Beersmith Forum a few weeks back, as well as made some significant security upgrades. The Beersmith Discussion Forum is a place where you can discuss all things brewing, including techniques, ingredients, equipment, pro brewing, and our Beersmith recipe software. Join the conversation today at beersmith.com/forum. Again, that's beersmith.com/forum. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.